Hey everyone, welcome to this special, we'll call it a special edition, a bonus episode of the family meeting. Now, we will have the family meeting at our normal time later today, 4 o'clock Pacific, 7 o'clock Eastern, with Kevin Briggins. We're going to be talking about Greenland, and we'll be talking about the recent debate that happened over the weekend with Ruslan and Joel Webben on interracial marriage. I've got a whole breakdown of that for you. But this afternoon, I wanted to do a very special conversation related to free speech. So let me know that you're watching. I see that some of you are hopping on, and that's awesome. And Jenny Sue is here. Glad I jumped on. Yeah, it's kind of an oddball time, but we have a special guest, and this was the time he could do it. So this is what we're doing. So we're going to talk about the First Amendment because boy, oh boy, is there a lot of conversation happening right now in the culture about the First Amendment and protected speech. And there's a lot of things trying to fly under the banner right now of protected speech. So I thought, you know what would be good is to get somebody who knows the Constitution, somebody who can speak to the First Amendment and try to help us define what did the original founding fathers mean when they wrote the First Amendment, and what is protected speech exactly. So we're going to talk about it. Glad to have you on. So let us know that you are watching and hop in the comments with your questions, and we will get into it. And with that, I'm going to bring on Mr. Mike Berry. Welcome, Mike.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Yes. And so let me get your lower third up here. You are from the First Liberty Institute. You know some things about the Constitution. Maybe just start off by giving us a quick thumbnail of what you guys do there at First Liberty Institute and how you work on issues related to free speech.
Well, sure. First Liberty Institute is a national religious liberty law firm. So, really, all we do is religious liberty cases. We exist to defend Americans' most fundamental right of religious liberty. And we've taken cases all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Probably the one that most people have heard of is the Coach Kennedy case. This was the football coach who was fired for taking a knee and praying for about 15 to 30 seconds after football games. We represented Coach Kennedy. I was one of his lead lawyers. It was a great honor and privilege in my life to be able to do that. And we won that case at the Supreme Court, which really kind of overturned 50 years of terrible Supreme Court precedent that was really creating a lot of religious hostility in our country. So my background and First Liberty's background, I should also mention too that we are pro bono, which means that everything we do is free of charge. None of our clients ever receive a bill. And that's because we operate as a faith-based nonprofit. That's our mission and our ministry to America. And so I come at the First Amendment and the Constitution from the background and the perspective of a religious liberty litigator, but obviously free speech goes hand in hand with the free exercise clause. Religious speech is a form of speech. It's a particularly fundamental form of speech that's been given a lot of protections by our courts over the years. So there are lots of overlaps, but there are some differences as well. Or I guess there's some gaps between purely religious speech and then the other types of speech that fall under the First Amendment.
Okay, cool. Well, maybe a good place to start would be just reading the First Amendment. Like, I don't know. If we're going to have a conversation about what free speech is, let's just start with the original document. So I've got this pulled up here, and I'm going to make it a little bit bigger for us. So this is from the constitution.congress.gov website. And so it says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so immediately, what jumps out to me is that it starts with the word Congress. Congress shall make no law. I mean, that makes me really have some questions about what the parameters are of this establishment. No law respecting the establishment of religion and prohibiting the free exercise or abridging the freedom of speech. So walk us through, like, what does this statement mean? How should we begin to think about this?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the very first word of the First Amendment to our Constitution, right, in our Bill of Rights, Congress. All right, so that's who this entire First Amendment, as it was originally drafted, applies to. That's who it was addressed to, and who it applies to. And when you think about the Constitution and our Bill of Rights, it's important to understand that it essentially is it's a governance document that establishes our government. It sets up the government and says what the branches of government are going to be. But then it also says these are the rights that the people have. And even before the Constitution was ratified in the 13 colonies, I think it's even important to go back further than that to understand what the founders who came to this country, who came to this land, they were fleeing religious persecution and political persecution from a lot of different places, primarily in Europe. And when they came here, they came from places that were often theocracies or had a state established a religion. So you had in England, the Church of England, right? In a lot of other countries, you had the Catholic Church that was essentially the established church for that nation. And so, and what ended up happening in a lot of those nations, in fact, still to this day, throughout most nations on earth, if you visit those nations and you ask people, what rights do you have? They're going to rattle off a bunch of rights and freedoms that they have, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of thought, freedom of belief, freedom to travel, et cetera, et cetera. What's interesting is when you ask them, how do you know that you have those rights? Most of the time they will say something along the lines of, because the government tells us that we have those rights, which means that these regimes, and this goes back for millennia, most of the time it's the only rights that you have are because somebody in power tells you you have those rights. So the only rights that you have are those that the authority, the government, recognizes. Our founders turned that idea completely on its head and said, no, right? Rights come from God, not from man, not from government. Our rights come from God. They're self-evident, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's what it says in the Declaration of Independence. And so when our founders established our system of government, they said rights pre-exist government. They exist outside of government. They are our God-ordained rights. And the role of the government is government doesn't create rights. The role of government is to recognize and protect those rights that already exist. That is the proper role of government. So that's the kind of the backdrop and the context for what the founders were doing when they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And when you get to the First Amendment, when I teach this to law students or high school students or college students, I often say it's important. You have to get in your time machine and go back to not just 1776, but even the years, the decades before, leading up to 1776. We didn't have 50 states. We had 13 colonies, right? And the 13 colonies were not unified in the manner in which we understand them today, right? We didn't have a union. We had really a 13 colonies that were cobbled together, but those 13 colonies each had very individual identities and cultures, to include religious cultures, right? So if you were to go back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the predominant and prevailing religion in the Massachusetts Bay Colony is what today we would refer to as Puritanism, I think they would have called it Congregationalism. If you were in Pennsylvania, Quakers were the predominant religious group. In Maryland, Catholics were the predominant religious group. In Virginia, you had the Anglicans, right? And so on and so forth. As you go one by one through the 13 colonies, you would probably be able to identify really, and in fact, if you look at the original constitutions as at the time they were drafted in each of the 13 colonies, you would see that each one of them established a state religion for that particular colony. And so when the First Amendment was drafted, the reason why it's important to understand that background and that context is what the framers, what the founders were doing was ensuring that now that there's this new thing called a federal government, right? We're creating this new federal government, that the federal government doesn't choose one specific religion as an established state religion. Because if the founders had said, we're going to make Quakerism the national religion of the United States, everyone in Pennsylvania would have been thrilled, and everyone else would have been very upset by that.
But in that context, isn't the word religion really better today called denomination? Like they weren't trying to establish a particular denomination, but the overall backdrop was still some kind of concept of the Christian God coming out of Judaism. Like there was some sort of operational assumption there.
Yeah, every one of the founders, almost without exception. There may be one or two that we can identify who may have leaned towards the deist side, where they recognized a supreme being or a deity of some kind. Right. They may not articulate it the way we would today as God or Jesus or something like that, but they would at least recognize some kind of deity. So we call them deists. They were in the minority. The vast majority were very much what we today would describe as coming directly from the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? We would recognize, and so yes, all of their writings at the time, all of their speeches at the time, all had that built-in assumption that it is perfectly acceptable. In fact, that's why, as I was saying, it was perfectly acceptable to them, and not only acceptable, but it was actually a good thing to them that these colonies would establish a state religion for that particular colony. What they didn't want was for there to be as you said, a single national religion or denomination is how we might really characterize it today. Because imagine back then, when there was still a lot of Catholic Protestant violence that was happening in Europe in particular, if they had established Catholicism as the national religion of the United States, there probably would have been a revolt among the other colonies, and they would have attacked the people in Maryland. And so what they did is say, our federal government is not going to establish a single denominational religion as the national religion of the United States. And so that's really where we get this notion of free exercise and the Establishment Clause. And the two really go hand in hand, that the people enjoy the right of free exercise. You can exercise your religious beliefs freely, but the government is not going to step in and say, oh, we prefer this one, so we're going to make this one the national religion. And so that's really the origins of the free exercise and establishment clauses. And now people ask, well, then how come today we don't really recognize that anymore, or it's evolved from that? And the answer is because in the late 19th and early 20th century, through a number of Supreme Court decisions, remember we fought a civil war in order to preserve the Union, right? And so the Union and the federal government became more centralized and stronger as a result of the Civil War. But there is also some legal consequences of that, one of which is called the doctrine of incorporation. And the doctrine of incorporation is, through a series of Supreme Court cases, basically says the Bill of Rights, so the 10 original amendments to the Constitution, are now incorporated to the states as well. So that's why you no longer have a state-established religion across the 50 states. You wouldn't have, in my home state of Texas, the state of Texas saying, "Oh, Texas is hereby a Methodist state or whatever. You just wouldn't have that today because it's understood that the doctrine of incorporation takes that establishment clause and incorporates it at the state level. So that's, again, probably an entire semester of First Amendment constitutional law in law school and condensed into 5-10 minutes or so
Yeah.
on the religion clauses. Now I know you also want to talk about the interplay between the religion clauses and the free speech clause as well.
Yeah, let's talk about the free speech clause because um, the First Amendment goes on to say that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of people to peaceably assemble. And what we're seeing kind of play out right now, I think, is pushing new boundaries of what these things mean and what constitutes as freedom of speech or the right of people to peaceably assemble. I mean, we're seeing a lot of things that are called peaceful protests that involve throwing rocks at law enforcement officers and spitting on them, cursing at them. And so it's like, all right, what are the boundaries here of the freedom of speech, and how has that been understood? And then talking about peaceable assembly and that sort of thing.
Okay, so two overarching principles when it comes to free
Okay.
speech, right? So the first one is one that you've already hit on, which is it's important to understand who free speech applies to, right? The government does not have a right of free speech, right? The government, again, the government doesn't create rights and it doesn't necessarily have rights. The government exists to recognize and protect rights. So the government, nobody would ever say the government has a free speech right to blah, 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 right? It's we, the people, that enjoy the right of free speech.
Okay.
So that's the first thing to make sure we get straight is that typically when we're talking about our constitutional rights, and in particular our First Amendment rights, the people are the ones that have the rights. Okay, and so the only thing that really applies that where the government, in the Establishment Clause, that's the one that's talking about what the government can and can't do. Everything else in the First Amendment is talking about what the people have a right to do.
Okay.
So speech is it's our right as citizens to free speech, not the government's right to say what it wants to say. Now, government can, and so in First Amendment doctrine, First Amendment, understanding, there is a doctrine called government speech, but that's not what we're talking about here. There's government speech and private speech. So when the government pushes messages out all the time, right? I mean, we see that with when a new administration takes over, they say this is now going to be what our message is. So yes, the government does engage in speech, but what I'm talking about is the protections that we enjoy under the free speech, and that applies to we the people. So that's principle number one. Principle number two is one of the things you learn in law school is that the law is very seldomly black and white. Most often it's what we call shades of gray. And I don't mean the terrible, novel series. I just mean, metaphorically speaking, it's people will say, oh, that's such a cut and dry, black and white issue, blah, 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 right? Oftentimes it's not. That's why lawyers, that's why people go to law school, right? Because lawyers remain gainfully employed because they're always finding ways to try to take something that seems like it should be black and white and say, well, actually, what about in this hypothetical scenario? Or what about in this scenario, right? And so free speech is no different. But we can start with some basic principles that most lawyers, most constitutional lawyers would say, okay, that's a pretty black and white principle. Okay, so what are and some of these people have heard of, you probably hear them, they're kind of cliche-ish, right? So the one that most people have heard of is you have the right to free speech, but like you don't have a right to yell fire in a theater, all right? So what does that even mean? When we say
exactly, what does that really mean?
What does that really mean?
Yeah.
Okay. So that really comes from a line of Supreme Court cases that say that while we generally enjoy a right to free speech in this country, meaning we can say whatever we want, right? And again, that originates, if you go back to the founding, why do we say you can say whatever you want? Where does that originate? It originates with this notion of, in a lot of despotic regimes, one of the very first freedoms, actually the two of the first freedoms that you see taken away, are the right to free exercise of religion. In other words, you cannot believe whatever you want to believe and practice your faith. Why is that? Because a despotic regime will never, ever tolerate people who submit to a higher authority than the government.
Right.
And if you say, my authority is God, not government, the government won't, a tyrannical dictator will never allow that, right? Because now the people are not beholden to the dictator, they're beholden to God. Similarly, they will never tolerate dissent or criticism. People who say, I disagree with what the dictator's doing, right? I disagree with what the Communist Party of China is doing. If we were in China right now, we would be censored for me saying that. If I were to say, I think the Communist Party of China is evil, it's malicious, it's harmful, right? It's, fill in the blank. The Communist Party of China would say, you are not allowed to say that, right? We would not enjoy free speech in that context. And so, but in our country, we say, no, you can say that. You have what we say, it's free speech. But then when people say, but you can't yell fire in a theater, what do they really mean by that is, okay, there are limits to your free speech. So while you can criticize the government, right? While you can voice dissent, you can voice disagreement, you can even voice protest with what the government's doing. Limits are things that would be reasonably likely to incite violence, right? So I couldn't say, I'm not, this is just me using this as a hypothetical. You could not say, hey, I want to devise a plot to, assassinate a government leader. You guys help me, right? I have a plan to carry it out in the next 30 minutes. Who's with me, right? So I'm trying to incite violence. And it doesn't even have to be against a government official. It could be, to use some examples from the headlines, I want to go firebomb a church. I need somebody to help me. Who's with me, right? You're trying to incite violence, harm, death, serious harm to another person or their loved ones. You don't have a right to you don't have a right to incite that violence. Now, through Supreme Court cases over the years, that doctrine has been really refined to mean, okay, what if I just say something like, I don't like that person, and I really hope a giant meteor falls on their house and something bad happens to them. Okay, that's protected, right? Like you have a right to say that because there's no realistic I don't have the ability to bring that out, right? To make that happen, right? So there's kind of a common sense thing there, right? So if I were just to say, I really hope a giant meteor falls on so-and-so's house and kills their family, that's not a nice thing for me to say, but because it's not reasonably unlikely to incite people to do anything, right? Then it's protected. Okay. Similarly, if I were to say, or I guess let me use the opposite example. But if I were to ask people to take up arms and to do something violent, right? Again, the one of the questions that the courts ask is it imminent? Is there an imminent threat? In other words, is it about to happen? Is it like, in other words, there's no ability for law enforcement to stop it or prevent it or investigate it. And so there's this timeliness aspect. If I just say, I hope that someday something bad happens to you, again, there's number one, there's no direct link between what I'm saying and what could potentially happen. And there's no, that's just some indeterminate point in the future. So courts are kind of look at that and say, again, and people ask, why is that? Why wouldn't you want to stop somebody from saying that? And I know in the younger generation, I often hear words are violence, right? Words when I grew up, it was sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me. It was, I may not agree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, right? I don't hear that anymore. I don't hear those sort of, slogans or mantras anymore. Now I hear silence is violence. I hear
words are violence.
Right. Yeah. Words are violence as well. If you don't agree with me, then you're harming me.
Right.
And I think those are um, those are absolutely wrong-headed applications of the First Amendment, right? And to say that I have a right to stop you from saying something, I have a right to censor you or to physically attack you because of what you've said, and then they try or to invade your place of worship, right? And because I disagree with what you believe or I disagree with something that I think that you represent, and then to turn that around, as we've seen some commentators do, and say, well, it's a free country. They have a First Amendment right to do that. Actually, no, they don't. You again, because that whole notion of if you are inciting others to engage in imminent acts of violence or threats of violence, there's Supreme Court cases that go way back that say that you do not. The First Amendment doesn't go that far, right? In other words, you can say and believe things, but what you can't do is cause those words to cause somebody else to spur them into conduct, into action.
So putting together a social media campaign or having a Discord chat that says, hey, everybody meet up at this time and place. We're going to, I don't know, we're going to assemble and just hold up signs on a corner, on a public street corner on the sidewalk. And we're going to stand there for 30 minutes and hold up our signs. That would be protected speech because they're not really calling out for violence to happen to a particular group. Whereas if I have a Discord chat and I say, we're all going to meet up in an hour and we're going to throw rocks at law enforcement together, that would not be a peaceably assemble free speech kind of a situation. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yes. Generally speaking, and obviously, again, there's always,
I'm being grossly general, and I'm talking
edges and come up with,
I got you.
Yeah, but generally speaking, yes. If you are inciting others to commit acts of violence or lawlessness, right? You don't have a First Amendment right to incite that, and the more imminent the threat is, the less likely you are to be able to say that you have a First Amendment right to do that. And so if I were to just say, hey, everybody, let's gather on the corner of Main and First Street and protest, a court would probably say, okay, what do you mean by protest? Are you just holding up signs? Or like you said, are you throwing rocks at cars? Are you asking people to step into moving traffic to cause accidents? Are you asking people to lay in the road to block traffic? Right? The more you are inciting people to do things that are violent or lawless, the less protected you are. So it's really, think of it on this sliding scale. And then the timeliness, right? Is it imminent? Or am I just saying, hey, it would be great if somebody did this, but I haven't set a time and a place and a date where this is going to happen, and I'm trying to organize this to happen. And so, and another interesting angle to this as well is going back to what I was talking about.
Wait, before we move on, somebody's asking a question.
Okay.
Is that protected assembly though? And if I'm understanding you correctly, you have the right to assemble and gather, but you don't have the right to assemble and gather and be violent. That's or
right.
Call for violence.
Right. You could ask people to gather together for a prayer vigil. That's and recall the actual words of the First Amendment say to peaceably assemble, right?
So peaceably assemble would not count as throwing rocks at law enforcement.
The court would have to define, well, what do they mean by, what does the First Amendment mean by peaceably? But yes, I think common sense would dictate that inciting violence or lawlessness is not peaceably assembling, right? Which is why when we see a lot of the mainstream media reports about things that were happening, during 2020 and other times in our, they always have that chyron that says mostly peaceful protests, right? And I think most people would
things
say
are burning in the background, though.
Yeah, right. Well, yes,
I don't understand that part.
Well, they would say that's the media kind of gaslighting us, right, by saying that this is mostly peaceful protesting. Well, okay, so mostly peaceful, does that mean partially violent? you know? Right. So,
Okay.
I don't want a partially violent protest either, right? I mean, that's what's funny about it but they're trying to make people think, oh, this is fine. This is protected by the First Amendment. But if you're looting, burning down buildings, injuring people, things like that. I mean, again, lawlessness and violence is not a peaceful assembly.
Well, let me play a really short clip. It's only like 30 seconds of the Minnesota Attorney General and just get your thoughts about what he is saying here, and then we can talk about it.
Do with whether they're going to focus or investigate you. So I wish in a normal time I would say no. I'd say this is First Amendment activity. In time like this, it's just really difficult to say because the only one thing is clear. If Trump likes you, you can do no wrong. If he doesn't, he's going to use every weapon he can against you, including our criminal justice system. Do with whether they're going to focus or invest.
So it's a little hard to tell there, like what he's saying. It seems like he wants to allow a space for these protesters, quote unquote protesters, disruptors who came into the church on Sunday, that, well, if they're the enemies of Trump and he doesn't like you, then he'll prosecute you. But is there a universe where storming into a church and screaming at people inside of church, is that protected speech? Is that peaceably assembling? Like, is it just a matter of bias on the part of, the Department of Justice? Like, walk us through some way of thinking about that situation.
Yeah. So you kind of have to break down this entire episode into some of its component parts, right? And not just the episode, but the arguments that are being made about whether it's protected or not protected, whether it's, First Amendment activity or unprotected activity. So the first thing, and there's a lot of misinformation that I've seen thrown out there in the news and social media elsewhere. So first thing is, one of the things that I hear a lot of people saying is, well, a church is public property. So anybody can walk into the church. Okay,
What makes it public property though?
It's not public property, right?
Okay.
That church is not owned, at least in probably 99% of the cases that I've seen, not owned by the government, right? It is owned by
Is it owned by the church?
Right. Yes, it is. Okay. The church.
I mean, I could see, like, if a church is meeting in a public park under a tree, like, all sure, right, that's on public property. But most of the time, churches own or rent property.
Yep.
Okay.
So it is. So that, and in this particular case, the city's church in Minneapolis, as far as I can tell, that is a church-owned building, right? It's not a government building that they just happen to be gathering in. It is a church. At least it looks like a church to me from all the videos and photos that I've seen. So it's private property. Now, the reason people are confused is because churches traditionally in our country have been open to the public to come, right? I mean, that's kind of one of the points of the church.
We have a welcome sign out in the front.
Everybody welcome, right? Or whatever. Right. But that doesn't make it public property. It's still private property that's just open to the public. Contrasted with my house is private property that's not open to the public. It's only open to people that I invite in, right? Whereas a business establishment is also private property, and the business owner gets to decide, the good old no shoes, no shirt, no service, right? They're saying not everybody is welcome here.
We refuse the right, or we have the right to
refuse service to anybody, right? So, right, that's a whole other First Amendment issue, because there's, you get into Jim Crow and all that, which is a different issue, but yeah. But so that's the number one. That's the first myth that we need to dispel. The church is not public property. It's private property that they invite people to come into. So then you say, okay, Well, they've invited people in. I'm just going in there to engage. And so, what are you doing in there, right? Are you going in there for the purpose for which the church has invited you in, which is to come and participate or at least attend this worship service? Or are you going in to disrupt the worship service? Because if you're going in to disrupt it, then my assumption is you are no longer welcome. You are not a welcome guest, right? And so and this is state law dependent, but it's potential that could be criminal trespass, right? If somebody comes onto your private property and you've asked them to leave and they refuse to leave, that is a form of trespass, that you don't have a right to be there anymore. And so the videos I've seen were the pastor of the church, or at least a representative of the church, was asking them to leave, and they refused to leave. So
could they have called 911, for example, and asked the police to come out and trespass?
They certainly could have. Yeah, they certainly could have.
Hopefully the police would have done that. I mean, everything was happening very, very quickly.
So the Attorney General of Minnesota also says, well, but they were engaged in First Amendment activity, so they have a right to do this. Okay. So again, I would break it down and say, what is it that they were doing in the church? Now, I would agree. I did not, at least none of the videos I've seen, I did not see acts of violence in the church.
Mm-hmm.
I did not see anyone physically assaulting. Yeah. I didn't see anyone, threatening to blow up a bomb or anything. They were. It was verbal only from the videos that I've seen.
You're a bad Christian. You're rich white people.
Right.
These kinds of things. Okay.
It's just harassing language. Okay.
Okay.
Now let's pause right there for kind of a little sidebar to say the fact that people are saying things that we find disgusting, abhorrent. Okay. As a career First Amendment and constitutional attorney, I will say the First Amendment protects your right to say things that other people find abhorrent and disgusting. Because if the First Amendment doesn't protect the right of somebody to say something that other people disagree with, then it doesn't mean anything at all, right?
Okay.
So that's important to keep in mind, is that just because they're saying things that are vile and filthy and disgusting, that alone is not sufficient to say, oh, well then you came out. The important thing is, were they welcome there, or were they asked to leave? Because that's where they crossed the line, right?
Okay.
And so at the point that they've been asked to leave and they refuse to leave, they are now essentially, number one, as we've identified, potentially, I don't know for sure, I'm not an expert, I'm not a Minnesota attorney, so I don't know what the laws are in Minnesota, but in most places that would be some form of criminal trespass.
Okay.
And number two, so the other thing where people say is, well, but the Minneapolis district attorney and the attorney general of Minnesota have already said, nope, not good. I didn't see anything, right? I'm not going to do anything. So is there some other legal issue that this raises? And the answer is yes. Under federal law, right? So you have state law and you have federal law.
Okay.
Under federal law, there is a law called the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances. So this was a law that was passed under President Clinton with strong support from Planned Parenthood and the ACLU. And this law was to protect abortion clinics.
It's called the FACE Act. If people
FACE Act, right. Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances. And they passed this law that basically said, if you are somebody who's protesting outside an abortion clinic, and you in any way interfere with the ability of a woman to access or enter that abortion clinic, you can be prosecuted.
So we can't block entrances. You
cannot block entrances.
Okay.
Right? You can't prevent people from going, because we've seen videos, right? Some of these videos of people, even well-meaning people, that were kind of harassing them and took things too far, right? I've seen those videos. Others have, I'm sure. And so that's the origin of the FACE Act. Funny thing happened. former Senator Orrin Hatch, conservative Republican senator, he was able to ensure that an additional provision got into the FACE Act that added churches or places of worship specifically to the protections listed under the FACE Act. So Senator Hatch said, all right, fine, if you're going to do this, we are going to include places of worship. So in other words, if you interfere with a place of worship or the ability of somebody to enter, access, or worship freely in that place of worship, same thing, you can be prosecuted for that under federal law. So that's where Attorney General Ellison is wrong, in that there is a federal law that makes it a crime for these people to do what they did.
Because they were blocking Christians from leaving? Is that it? What would be the...
No, they were interfering with the act of worship.
I see. Okay.
They were disrupting, right? So it's a place of worship that, now, like if they had just gone in there after the service was over, and perhaps maybe a very different question, but to go in during the service while members of the congregation are actively engaging in the free exercise of their religion, right? Going back to the very first thing we talked about.
Yeah.
We have a First Amendment right in this country to freely engage and freely exercise our religion. And we have a law now that says, even if it's not the government doing it, even if it's private citizens that are coming in and trying to inhibit or disturb my ability to do that, I now have the ability to bring a legal claim against them under the FACE Act.
So what if they had stood on the sidewalk outside the church and screamed at the congregants as they were going in and said, you know, you're unloving, you're not Christ-like, you're not real Christians, you're full of hate, where are you? And standing up for your Somalian fellow people, humans. Like if they were standing out on the sidewalk, as long as they weren't blocking the entrance to get in, would that have been lawful potentially?
Potentially, yes. And in fact, I think we see that happen a lot, right? I mean, I've seen it happen. Again, as long as they were not interfering with or inhibiting the ability of someone to enter that church or disrupting their worship inside the church. But if they were just standing outside, because the sidewalk, right, at some point, the church's property, the private property ends.
That's what I'm thinking.
Right. And that's when it becomes public property. So if they are not on private property and they're on public property and they're just picketing or even yelling, okay, right. Yes, they have a right to be there and they have a right to say those things. So the way that lawyers would often kind of think about this is, do you have a right to be in the place where you're engaging in what you claim to be? If you're going to claim First Amendment protection for what you've done, the first question is, do you have a right to be there? And then the second question is, do you have a right to say what you've said? And we've basically covered both of those. Is if you're inside a church and you're no longer welcome, and it's been made very clear to you that you're no longer welcome and you've been asked to leave and you refuse to leave, then you don't have a right to be there. Any more than you have a right to be in my living room if I've asked you to leave my living room, my house, right? And then second, do you have a right to say what you said? And that goes back to that doctrine of, am I trying to incite imminent violence? But on top of that constitutional doctrine, sometimes you have federal laws like the FACE Act that say, oh, by the way, if you are interfering with somebody's ability to worship, that's also a crime, right?
How important, see, here's what bothers me is I'm afraid all this happens and there's no accountability. Like in my study of scripture, of God's justice, one of the key principles of biblical justice is that of accountability, that there is some kind of consequence to the law. But when we've jettisoned accountability, I think my biggest concern is that nothing's going to happen to these people. Like, and then that's going to embolden more groups like this to storm places of worship, and that worst case scenario is that it devolves into violence and we have people going in there with weapons. That would be horrible. But I guess what are your thoughts about the potential for accountability? Like, do you think anything's going to happen if the local officials aren't going to enforce the law and they're just going to kind of, oh, I lost him. There he goes. And that there's what are your thoughts if the local officials won't do it? Do you think the feds will? I don't know. I'm kind of pessimistic about um human the human nature.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get overly theological or spiritualize it, but I think that there is the notion of biblical accountability, essentially eternal accountability,
mhm,
and then there's also accountability in this life, right? Worldly accountability, and whether or not we see accountability in our lifetimes
mhm,
at the worldly level, that doesn't mean that there won't be accountability
sure.
on the eternal
Yeah.
side. Um, and I lately have been on a kind of an Old Testament kick, and one of my favorite books in the Old Testament is Habakkuk. And Habakkuk, for those who aren't familiar, I'll summarize Habakkuk chapter 1. Habakkuk is observing this group of people called the Chaldeans, who were described as a violent and impetuous people. Like they were nasty. I mean, they were nasty, and they were excellent horsemen. That's what I also recall. And Habakkuk describes the Chaldeans as laying waste to the land. And he cried out to God, and he said, "Why do you allow violence and injustice to occur, but yet nothing happens?" So it's kind of like what you were saying, right?
Yeah.
I fear that violence and injustice will just continue to perpetuate throughout the land, and nothing is going to happen to the perpetrators. That's basically what Habakkuk is crying out to God. And God finally answers Habakkuk. Habakkuk even says, why do you hear my cry, but no, you don't answer? And God finally goes, all right, Habakkuk, you want to know my answer? My answer is that I'm doing a great work, but I haven't told you about it, because even if I had told you what I was doing, you wouldn't believe me. You wouldn't believe me. And so the conclusion that I draw from that is God does not and has not left his throne. He's still on the throne. He still reigns supreme. He rules over all the affairs of man, and he cares deeply for the affairs of man. We are his loved creation, and he wants to see us, righteous and holy, but we rebel. We continuously rebel. Today, just as the Chaldeans did. And he says, but don't you worry your little heart about it, because God's basically saying, I've got this, okay? I've got this. And the fact that you don't see what I'm doing, it's just because I haven't revealed it to you. Deuteronomy 29:29 says, the things revealed belong to man, but the things not revealed belong to the Lord. Another great Old Testament book, right? And God's saying, I just haven't revealed to you what I'm doing, because even if I did show you, if I showed you my whole plan, you wouldn't believe me. So why would I show it to you? So again, not to like overly spiritualize or get overly theological, but I always rest comfortable in the knowledge that, you know what, God is going to judge the souls of those who carry out such acts, and it's our job to do everything in our power to hold accountable those who deserve to be held accountable. But even if they aren't held accountable in our lives, right, we can still trust God and his infinite justice. And so
Yeah.
that's kind of that's my take on these things. And people ask, well, what do you think should happen? I think, honestly, if that were my congregation in my church, I would encourage other people. I said, we as Christians should forgive what has happened, but the federal government, because their laws have been violated, when you violate the law, there has to be, right? Like you said, there has to be accountability. So the federal government should be investigating and potentially prosecuting for violations of the FACE Act. So even though we, the believers, the people in the congregation who've been harmed, we can forgive, but the government still has the ability to step in and say, yeah, I'm really glad that you've forgiven them and haven't like become vigilantes, but we, the government, we're not necessarily so quick to forgive or forget. We're going to investigate, and if we find evidence sufficient to prove criminal acts beyond a reasonable doubt, then we will prosecute.
No. Well, this has been helpful. I'm watching the chat, a lot of good comments in there. I think we've addressed most of the things that people have brought up. There is one thing, one comment that I don't think we've addressed. If it could be established that this group is targeting a specific network of churches, would that potentially carry an extra legal consequence?
Yeah, without knowing the specific, federal statutes that might trigger, I would be surprised if that doesn't trigger some kind of, additional ability, because now it's targeted. It's essentially like kind of the church equivalent of a hate crime, right? If you're targeting a specific group and singling them out because of what they believe, that sure looks, like a hate crime. And if it, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it probably is. And so that's my take on that, is that if it can be shown with evidence that they are trying to single out specific churches or groups because of whatever it is that they believe, then look, there's we've been dealing with that in our country for a long time on issues with race, religion, right? And now here it is rearing its ugly head again.
Very good. All right. Well, thanks for doing this, Mike. I'm sure I'll be reaching out to you again in the future. There's probably a number of topics you and I could dialogue about, but thank you for hopping on with me and helping to provide some clarity about these issues. And because sometimes, like, moving beyond the sound bites and then the Twitter videos and everything, like, how do I put this together in, a more comprehensive understanding? So thanks for just kind of walking us through all of that, taking us all the way back to the founders. I appreciate it.
Yeah, you guys got like a full, 2 semesters of law school in 50 minutes. So.
Right. Very cool. All right, friend. Thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate you coming on.
Happy to do it.
All right. We'll see you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All right, family. Hopefully you enjoyed Mr. Mike Berry. Mike and I have been talking a bit behind the scenes on other topics, so I'm sure I will be having him on again in the future and look forward to those conversations. In the meantime, again, I want to let you know that I will be streaming again at the normal time, 4 o'clock Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Have our normal family meeting with Kevin Briggins and myself. We'll be talking about Greenland and the recent Ruslan versus Joel Webbin and company debate on the question of interracial marriage. Boy, is that a nuancey conversation. So tune in for that. All right, friends, we will see you soon. And make sure to share this with a friend, someone who's confused and needs better information and news sources. All right, take care. Have a good week. Grace and peace.